Researchers that are interested in moving beyond the idea of the organization as a container have explored organizations being produced through the communication that occurs within them. This shift is known as the of the organization, or CCO, which I'll just refer to it a lot throughout the semester as CCO. This moves away from viewing the organization as something that's static. Instead, it thinks of the organization as something that is more realistic and more dynamic, through which communication is the central mechanism in which the organization is constituted. CCO researchers argue that communication is not just a process that happens within the organization. Instead, it is something that is it is the very means by which organizations come into existence and continue to evolve. So these scholars will emphasize the mechanisms by which our interactions form, recreate, and ultimately change organizations. And they advocate, people who take this position advocate for a focus on organizing as a verb rather than the organization as a noun. In addition to broad notions of social constructionism, various theoretical traditions have really shaped the CCO approach. And first of all is Giddens' structuration theory. If you've ever taken a social theory class, you've probably heard of Giddens. It's foundational. And according to structuration theory, our social reality is really created by being active in the creation of that reality. And this is done through what Giddens calls agency. And agency implies that individuals have a capacity, they have it within their power to act differently in any given context. And they take actions which draw on the rules and the resources or the structures. So those constitute the structures in an organization that guides and also modifies the organization through our interactions with other people, through the communication. Think of this as when you're grocery shopping, to illustrate how this works. You're grocery shopping, and typically shoppers will follow some very explicit rules. They're using, they're paying, typically, they're using the express lane for limited items, and they're drawing on tacit norms to interact with people that work in the grocery store. I don't know, whichever region you're in, there may be one grocery store that you're more familiar with than others. These structures are flexible. Clerks might waive rules sometimes, or customers may engage more socially and subtly alters the norms that are commonplace. This illustrates the structural duality of the CCO approach, that structures guide the action, but are also shaped by it. A central idea in CCO. For example, you may have the norm of using the express lane if you have 10 items or less, but if you have 12 items, they may still let you come in. This is the idea that the organization is not static, it is dynamic. This illustrates the structural duality. That structures guide actions and are also shaped by it, and shaped by us by extension because we perform those actions. Discourse is another core concept in CCO. Be familiar with. And discourse is used variably in scholarship. Some scholars criticize it for being vague in organizational contexts, though. Discourse, that's the only definition that matters right now. Discourse encompasses spoken texts and social behaviors that reflect systems of meaning. For example, how a nurse speaks to a patient embodies institutional compassion. Some scholars, Ferris and Putnam, for example, have identified the different ways of analyzing organizational discourse. And some scholars see organizations as more stable entities with well-defined discursive traits, hospitals that dictate specific communication styles. Others embrace the idea of becoming the organization. Discourse is organizing itself. This is an abstract philosophical idea, I understand, and it may not sound like it's applicable, but it plays into the assumptions that we have and the practices that we consider to be normal within our organization. The things that are encouraged or discouraged, the things that we're rewarded for, the things that we're praised for, the things that we get promotions for, the things that people listen to. A corporate mission statement or text, okay, will influence a strategy meeting, which is speech, okay? And that generates new goals, more texts, and so on. And this creates a self-organizing cycle. That's what they would say. So this really comes out of what's called the Montreal School of CCO. So the Montreal School of CCO the Montreal School of CCO has been especially influential in the development of this perspective because these scholars emphasize the co-orientation process. It's a process through which individuals coordinate activity via their interaction. Co-orientation involves speech and text. Speech refers to the real-time conversation, and text is the stabilized meaning of documents, of policies and rules, and of, I guess, articulated values. So what does the organization value? What do they claim to value? Those are your texts. Okay. Montreal School scholars propose there are degrees of separation to describe how communication becomes material. First, the conversation embeds intent, and this is narrated to others. Secondly, it is then transcribed into a formal plan, specialized language emerges. And then fifth, the physical infrastructure appears. As a result of this process, kiosk shows up, a manual appears, a new perk at your office is suddenly available. And then finally, the system expands widely so others will adopt it. So whether it's a nonprofit adopting your model, or whether it's your franchises that are adopting an approach you're taking. Okay. That is your introduction to the Montreal School. Another CCO model is the four flows model. And the four flows is also developed from this school of thought. It's from McPhee. The four flows model really emphasizes the types of communication flows that occur. And so there are four, obviously, right? There's membership negotiation, which is asking the question, who joins the organization? There's also self-structuring. That's number two, how rules are formed and shaped and implemented. And then there's activity coordination. How is work done is the question here. And then institutional positioning considers the external relationships across departments, across organizations, across institutions, and each flow. And so each flow supports core organizational functions. Membership negotiation, which is the first one, considering who joins, includes hiring and socialization and recruitment and these things. Self-structuring, which remember is the consideration of how rules form, will produce manuals and policies and charts and process diagrams. Activity coordination is the everyday doing of tasks, that checklist. Get the checklist done. And then institutional positioning refers to how organizations relate to other institutions. Both the Montreal and the Four Flows scholars, which are very closely interconnected, actually Four Flows is a part of Montreal, argue that communication doesn't just reflect organization, it constitutes it. And they highlight in these approaches how the reciprocal links between micro-level interactions and macro-level structures coalesce and coordinate the organizational system of meaning that we exist in. These models remind us that organizations emerge through ongoing dynamic and structured communication. So if we think about the difference between the micro-level interaction that occurs and the macro-level interaction, if you think about this in the healthcare context, nurse that's finishing a shift tends to communicate detailed patient updates to the incoming nurse during a handoff to another nurse. They might say, yes, he took his medications, or she took her medications, or he refused to take his medications this afternoon. And they may convey, we need to perhaps revisit the dosage or something like that. So this information is the micro level interaction. And that plays into the macro level structure, which is over time, repeated conversations like this across many nurses and shifts create and lead to the hospital administration realizing that handovers are maybe inconsistent, or handovers could be more consistent. And in response, the hospital develops a more standardized protocol. That's your macro level structure for shift handovers. Typically, they have this in the form of checklists in hospitals, especially in inter-organizational teams. This includes things like required fields on a form, so medication adherence, pain levels, new symptoms that emerge, improvement, whatever the necessary criteria is to go through. Scheduled check-ins with physicians for recurring issues. Once implemented, the protocol will shape the micro-level interactions by guiding, nudging what information nurses need to communicate. Those interactions can still influence the protocol. if nurses find the form too rigid, or if they miss key patient details, they may give feedback that leads to structural revisions as well. So it's not fixed. Even after the macro level implementation is done, it doesn't mean that it's fixed like that. That's really what CCO considers. That's CCO. I think you get the point. Welcome to the class. I'm glad that you're in here. If we're doing this lesson in the middle of the semester, then just know I'm happy that you're here as well.